So to some, the police are doing a good job in fighting violent crime. Others say police are heavy-handed. It comes after 9 suspects were killed in a shootout with police at Mariannhill in KwaZulu-Natal in the early hours of Wednesday. A few hours later, another 5 suspected robbers were gunned down by police in a foiled cash and transit heist, this time in Mpumalanga. Rifles and handguns were reportedly recovered in that operation. Just how should police react, and are they winning the war against crime? Well, to unpack this further, we're joined by Professor Nirmala Gopal, a criminologist from UKZN. Professor, good afternoon, and thank you very much for your time.
Good afternoon, Mfundo, and I'm happy to be part of this, your news bulletin, and you're most welcome.
It's a pleasure to have you with us, Professor. So, Professor, the media space right now is awash with opinion pieces on lethal force this week, and it's following the killing of the 9 suspects, with some stating that the response was disproportionate to the threat posed by the suspects at the time, while others have lauded the police. Your views on what we've seen this week?
So, Mfundo, I think it's legitimate and justifiable if we're having different schools of thought in terms of some individuals identifying this as excessive use of force, whilst the others are lauding it as a success for the police. I think let's take a step back and understand what does the populace of South Africa want? And one of their priorities is to reduce crime in South Africa. And I think when we talk about reducing crime in South Africa, the first people we look to is the South African Police Services. And when we look at the South African Police Services, we know that Section 205 of the Constitution gives them the authority and the right to protect the country, provide peace and security. So on the one hand, we have the Constitution that gives them that right to protect us. On the other hand, we have the right to life, and we have the right to dignity, etc. And I think balancing those two rights and balancing the one right and the responsibility becomes extremely crucial. Mm-hmm. But in addition to the Constitution, the police have what is called the Criminal Procedure Act, and the Criminal Procedure Act speaks to the issue of force, but of course force with discretion.
Mm-hmm. Now, if we had to just unpack the principles for the use of force, because they are well documented, there's the legality principle where you are using force for legal aims. There's necessity, which speaks to a scenario where there's no alternative or less violent options to achieve the same ends. With just what we know of the scene in Desai and Mariannhill, do you believe there was no alternative to achieve the same ends?
I mean, I think there will always be alternatives if we had to look very, with a fine tooth comb. But of course, not having been at the scene of the crime, I would not want to believe that the police used the amount of force they did, which was fatal force really, without first assessing the reasonable necessity of that force or the proportionality in terms of the circumstances. So I want to seriously believe that the police believed that there was no alternative, because if they didn't act within the confines of the Constitution and the confines of the Criminal Procedure Act, then they are not above the law, and they will have the judicial system to answer to. Mm-hmm. And I think it's the judicial system or the judiciary that will be the only space where we will have justice, whether it's for the police officers or for the suspects that were killed.
Mm-hmm. To what extent does the profile of a region inform the response by police? Profile of a region meaning, in this instance, there's always been the profiling of KZN as one of the most violent for decades now. So to what extent does the profile of a province or region inform the response of police in that area?
Constitutionally, morally, and legally, that shouldn't have any impact. Mm-hmm. So you respond based on the context, and depending on depending on the risk to the police officer and risk of people around in the community at that particular point in time. So the profile, yes, of course, that's background information, that's contextual information. It would make you perhaps more alert, and it would allow you to profile the possible suspects that you're dealing with. But I don't think any of our legislation or procedures prescribe the amount of force one should use depending on the profile of that particular province, region, etc.
And to what extent does the proliferation of guns contribute to the violence in KZN?
I think that's very contentious, but definitely the proliferation of illegally obtained guns, I think that is a huge contributing factor to the violence in KZN. Well, like in other parts of South Africa as well. When you obtain these guns illegally, because then you don't know who to trace it back to. And that, I think, is a challenge for us.
Now, still on just what happened there with the 9 suspects that were killed, some have raised a very important point about the uncertainty of the criminal status of the suspects. No one can say for certain that they were guilty. It was only going to be something that was determined in a court of law. Your take on just that point raised by some?
I think that's a really interesting point. So I think what will have to happen is that I'm sure IPID will have to be part of the investigation now that you've had fatalities or casualties, and find ways in which they can actually link the suspects or some of the suspects to crimes that have been committed. I'm not sure what the actual techniques, the forensic techniques, identification techniques in, posthumously SAPS actually has, but I'm sure IPID will have to come up with some very creative ways, if those don't already exist, to try and link these suspects to some crimes. But I think the fact that they were resisting arrest could count for something. And if they were, for one, resisting arrest in a reasonable way, and which forced, it must have forced SAPS to use the level of force, or force, which was of course fatal force. I think that in itself would be a violation, could count for some kind of violation. But of course, remember, SAPS will have to prove this in a court of law as well. Because nobody is above the law. I think one thing we must remember is that nobody is above the law, not even SAPS officials.
The police commissioner once stated in an interview that there's something almost unique to suspects in KwaZulu-Natal. I'm sure there are other instances where suspects would respond in the same manner, but nevertheless, he stated that it seemed to be more prevalent in KwaZulu-Natal that suspects would resist arrest and opt to rather find themselves in a shootout with police. Why exactly is this? Is there some brazen behavior or confidence of late? What exactly is this?
I think it could be a plethora of reasons, really. One could be that they're really brazen. The other one is that they don't want to be arrested, because being arrested could mean life imprisonment, and these are usually career criminals. And which career criminal or person who has a particular career wants their career intercepted? So that could be another reason for it.
All right, Professor, thank you very much for your insights this afternoon. That's Professor Nirmala Gopal from UKZN. She is a criminologist.